To discuss America's dependence on NATO, our relations with Russia, today's threat of radical Islam, and tomorrow's looming threat of an ever more powerful communist China. In other words, tonight we will examine America's long-term strategic positioning in the world. It's always valuable to look at history as well as the present before considering the future. So let's start with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It made sense. NATO made sense when it was created. It made sense to strengthen the NATO alliance during the 1950s, while the Soviet Union was forming its Warsaw Pact, and while the fall of China to communist tyranny and the Korean Wars halted the vision of a peaceful world that we had been dreaming of in the aftermath of World War II. But in the 1950s, that was a threat. But the 1950s are ancient history. The Cold War is over. This is the 21st century. NATO no longer serves its purposes and is, in many ways, counterproductive. Ronald Reagan's visionary leadership, coupled with the unrelenting commitment and courage of the American people, brought an end to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The people of Eastern Europe were freed from a hostile occupation and puppet Marxist governments. In the 1990s, the Russians dramatically moved away from domestic tyranny and away from a belligerent foreign policy. Freed from its Soviet shackles, Russia expected to be embraced. At least if they weren't embraced, they certainly expected to be accepted as the Russians moved their troops out of occupied nations and opened up its political and economic system. It was perhaps the greatest peaceful resolution of a hostile confrontation between major global powers in history. NATO played an important role in bringing us to that point in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The armed might of NATO deterred aggression and Soviet adventurism that could have resulted in a world conflict. NATO, with American leadership, won for Western civilization a new chance at building a future of progress, freedom, and tranquility on a global scale. In the last 20 years, there's been a change on a massive scale, most of it for good, in the former Soviet Union. Certainly, elements of this transition have been counterproductive and short of expectations and disappointing to the people of Russia, as well as peace-loving people in the West who had such high expectations. But by and large, enormous positive changes have taken place in Russia over these last 20 years. It is in vogue now in some circles to suggest the current leadership in Russia is similar to the communist thuggery of those who not so long ago ruled that country with an iron fist and threatened world peace. Let this cold warrior shock you by suggesting that the Russian government's flaws, and they have many flaws, do not reflect a fundamental malicious nature, as was the case under communism. And while there are examples of heavy-handedness, there is ample evidence of freedom of speech, religion, and enterprise. Within this context, the vilification of Russia by old cold warriors, my friends, most of them, has been unconscionable and unrelenting. The fall of communism, the restructuring of its society, Russian forces, of course, withdrawing from Eastern Europe, this was breathtaking. These were breathtaking events. Clearly, the Russian people and the Russian government wanted to be part of the Western community if they were willing to take such dramatic steps. The door was open, and the Russians were not only willing but anxious to leave Cold War hostilities behind. They were naive, and so were we, about the transition. This historic opportunity has almost totally been squandered. During the transition, rotten elements in the West allied themselves with nefarious Russian elites, and together they took advantage of their country's weakened and vulnerable condition. Russia was looted, and much of the loot ended up in Western banks. Vast natural resources ended up in the hands of a few power brokers. Billions of dollars of Russian wealth, basically mineral wealth, was transferred to private hands for a pittance. The Russian people, rejected and isolated when they expected to be partners in building a new world, sunk into despair. Adding to their sense of helplessness, Russia was frozen out of the world market and relegated to the fringe market like Iran. Let us note that today we are suffering because of that effort to isolate Russia from the global economy. I remember shortly after the communists fell in Russia, I went to my own aerospace industry leaders and said, we've got to let the Russians compete with us. This is the one area, high technology, where they can compete. And of course, the reaction to our major aerospace companies was, no way. And for 7 years after the fall of communism, Russia, which had invested enormous resources in rocket technology, were not permitted to sell their services for launch services to the West for 7 full years. That was the one area they could have really raised some hard currency, and we denied that to them. Well, at the same time, what did our friends in Europe do? Of course, Europe, by its very nature, the European Union is a cartel, excluding other countries like Russia. But instead of utilizing Russian missile and rocket technology to launch satellites, our European allies rushed forward to spend hundreds, maybe $150 billion in developing their own launch capabilities. Again, instead of letting Russia be part of the world market, they were frozen out. And how does this relate to Iran? Their scientists were earning $50 a month. People with PhDs, the top level of their society, the cream of the scientific crop, starving, seeing their families suffering. They were looking around, so they were relegated to the fringe. And they went to Iran, and Iran agreed to hire them to build a nuclear reactor. I remember this very well. During the Clinton administration, I went to top people in the Clinton administration and explained this will eventually be a horrible catastrophe, a threat, a huge threat to the United States and the West if we permit this nuclear power plant in Iran to be finished. I said, but we shouldn't be threatening the Russians, which is what we did. Our government policy was, don't do it or you're going to suffer. Instead of saying, look, we know your people are unemployed, we'll get you a contract financed by the World Bank, wouldn't have cost us anything, to build 2 power plants, maybe one in Turkey, maybe one in Malaysia, maybe one in another country that needed electric power. Instead, we just threatened them, and of course they had no other alternative. We didn't give them that alternative. And so now we face this problem. By the way, shortly after George W. Bush was elected, I went to see Condoleezza Rice, made the same argument. We've got to act now. If we act now, we can give the Russians an alternative in which they do not have to build this nuclear reactor for the Iranians. But let's give them the alternative. Again, it was only threats and talk about punitive actions, but no willingness to offer the Russians a positive alternative. So of course they had to get their people employed. We're going to find out a lot about that in the months and years ahead as our own experts find themselves unemployed. And we care about them just like the Russian people cared about their people. But we did not at that time reach out to help the Russians, and we are paying a price for that now. It's important to look back at the end of the Cold War and to recognize the mistakes that have been made, and it has become clear that there were many, many mistakes that were made by the Russians, yes, but also by us and our European allies. Now, however, is not the time to just lay blame. And I didn't relate that story to blame the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or anyone else. But realizing what that mistake was, We now should move forward